Hi, my name is Rick Stepp-Bolling, and I am the author of the book Ulan, and I'll be reading the first chapter for you. The Sum-Nord winds whipped fine grains of Sumian desert and hurled them at Ulan. For a moment, she withstood the sharp, stinging sand as it bit into her exposed arms and face, allowing her the opportunity to experience physical pain instead of the deeper agony of shame. Then she affixed a sand wrap and adjusted the tunic to cover her arms. 5 older boys formed a circle around her. Their tunics flapped noisily in the strong wind, revealing leather-handled knives tucked into their belts. They threw taunts at her like well-aimed stones. "Little whore, go back to your father's home," the tallest boy cried. "You don't belong here." "Did he send you to fuck with us?" said the boy with crooked teeth. "Is that what you want to do? Go home, little leper, or back into whatever hole you call home," the boy with bulging eyes said. The 6th boy stood outside the circle, his head down, his arms tightened against his chest. Through the wrap, she saw the boys walk slowly around her, inching closer with each insult they hurled. Their bared faces took the brunt of the swirling winds and biting grains, hatred etched in each one. If she ran, escaping to the open desert, they would track her down, hunt her like some wild beast. And then what? What would they do? She imagined the worst. Use their knives to make her submit? Never. She would fight them until her last breath. Ulan struggled to calm her breathing, slow her heart, but it pounded so loudly she thought it would burst at any moment. She tried to reach for the knife wedged into her boot, but fear kept it rooted in the sand. "Is the little bitch going to cry? I think I see some tears." "Don't cry, little bitch. You've got thicker hide than that." "Enough!" The 6th boy broke into the circle, his hands clenched into whitened fists. "Enough! Leave her alone." The boys stopped. The largest stepped forward, his arm raised, his finger pointing at Ulan. "She's a whore, Kip. You don't want to defend a whore. You know what we do to whores." Kip faced the taller boy. "She's not a whore. She's not a bitch. She's a girl. A girl. Just leave her alone." The winds began to ebb, the sand settling back into the desert, leaving the boys fully exposed to the harsh reality of their own actions. "She doesn't belong here, Kip. And if you're going to stand up for her, you don't belong here either." The tallest boy searched the ground for rocks. When he found a good throwing stone, he tossed it up and down in his hand. One by one, the boys gathered stones and put them into their pockets, keeping one in each hand. Kip put himself in front of the nearest boy. "You don't want to do this, Ta. She's done nothing wrong. This is not our way." The larger boy shoved Ta aside as he approached Kip. "Our way? Our way? What would you know about our way? You came from Sum Est. Maybe that's the way they do things in Sum Est, but it's not our way. It's not the way we do things in Clan Hemite." He juggled the rock in his hand, feeling the weight, judging his distance, calculating his throw. "Step aside, Kip. Your last warning." A shot reverberated through the air, putting a large hole in front of the boy's feet. The superheated sand sizzled, forming a glass residue around the blast cavity. Men in dark blue uniforms with lightning bolts on their sleeves hopped off sand sleds and gathered behind the boys, their rifles leveled. Ulan's breathing stopped. Imperial Panthers, death squads, Fear froze the tears welling in her eyes. "Sergeant, why don't you ask these boys what they're doing outside the compound?" A bearded giant of a man strode forward. "Be a pleasure, sir." His crooked smile matched a face divided by an ugly scar running from his scalp to his chin. He approached the largest boy, who still clutched the rock in his hand. The sergeant drew a long knife from his boot and jabbed the boy in the chest. "What are you doing outside the compound, boy? Past curfew." The boy bowed his head and released the stones from his hands. They plopped into the sand at his feet. The other boys dropped their stones, keeping their hands at their sides. The sergeant turned to the officer and grinned. "Guess we're not communicating." He turned back to the boy and pushed his tunic aside with his knife. "Well, what have we here?" He reached for the leather handle, but the boy pushed his hand away. Sheathing his knife, the sergeant grabbed the boy by the neck with one hand and lifted him off the ground. With his other hand, he withdrew the leather-handled blade from the boy's waistband. "Illegal to carry weapons, and out after curfew. That's 2 strikes, boy." The sergeant looked to the officer, who gave him a brief nod in return. With a violent jerk, the sergeant snapped the boy's neck. The boy went limp in his hands, and the sergeant dropped his body onto the sand. Ulan stared in disbelief at the dead boy, his head unnaturally angled from his body. A few seconds ago she had wished him dead, and now she struggled against the idea that she may have caused this. The officer stepped forward and kicked the body. "I believe there may be additional miscreants. With the rest of you, please pull back your tunics and show your waistbands." One by one, the boys turned their heads, only to find an imperial panther stationed behind each. Ta was the first to react. He sprinted toward the compound, screaming as he ran. A single shot followed. Ta's body fell headless to the ground. "Now, do I need to repeat myself? Your tunics, boys." With shaking hands, the boys lifted their tunics and revealed their knives. That wasn't difficult, now was it? "Next, if you will please take 2 fingers and remove the blades from your belts." The boys did as they were told, holding their knives at arm's length. "Good. Now, drop your weapons." The sand softened the dull thuds of steel hitting the ground. Kip was the last to let his fall. "Sergeant, would you hand me one of those blades?" The burly soldier picked up the knife from the dead boy's body and brought it to the officer. He turned the blade over in his hand, inspecting it as though it were made of the finest steel. "Homemade. Worthless, actually, in hand-to-hand combat. You boys really should take up smithing." "Gentlemen, carotid." The panthers unsheathed their knives and grabbed the boys. The sergeant stepped forward and gripped Kip's arm in an iron-like vise. With a single cut, each boy's artery was slashed. The panthers released the boys and watched as they squirmed on the ground, struggling to stop the flow of blood and the end of their lives. A scream caught in Yolande's throat. She closed her eyes, trying not to smell the overpowering reek of blood in the air, trying not to hear the death gurgles of the boys. Then she felt strong hands around her arms. The sergeant ripped her tunic away, revealing an empty waistband. She bit his hand and dropped straight down when he loosened his grasp. The sergeant took a swipe as she fell, only to come away with her sandwrap. Ulan rolled away from the sergeant and into the hands of the officer. "Well, look what we have here." The officer held a braid of thick black hair in his fist. "A girl." The men laughed as the officer held her head up to them. "What? No knife?" The men howled again. Ulan felt the hardened blade of her knife against her calf. Tears came quickly to her eyes. "You want to play with boys, little girl?" The officer took the slain boy's knife and cut her braid. "Then you should look like one too." Ulan dropped to the ground, and the officers kicked her away. "Now go back to the compound and tell everyone there what happens when they leave the curfew after curfew with weapons." With that, the panthers filed past her and into their sand sleds. Ulan, her shorn head with her hands, feeling violated beyond belief. Searching desperately for the only thing that could protect her, she found the knife and threw it into the dust left by the departing sleds. "I have a weapon," she screamed, then collapsed into the warm sand, sobbing, "I have a weapon too." End of chapter 1.